It's a brisk October day. The gun goes off, and 10,000 people start moving together in the same direction for the same reason. That's the race for the cure. And for a generation, pink wasn't just a color, it was a cause.
And that was the promise.
And also the paradox. Komen is both a major breast cancer institution and the organization that helped turn pink into one of the most recognizable symbols in American charity culture.
So the question isn't whether that mattered. It's what happens when a symbol created to serve a mission starts to become larger than the mission itself.
Where did the pink ribbon come from? What did it mean when it started? And what does it mean now when the same color shows up on corporate campaigns, consumer products, and endless spin-offs that borrow the language of breast cancer awareness without really belonging to it?
Do you think a cause can own a color?
Or does the color eventually start lending the cause its power?
Right, that's the paradox.
And it's why Komen is such a revealing case. I'm Revi Sterling.
And I'm Alyssa Stern, and this is Impact.
Quick disclaimer. Impact is for information and entertainment only. Nothing here is financial, legal, or professional advice. The views are ours alone, not our employers, not our clients, and not anyone we've ever worked for. We fact-check against primary sources and correct mistakes. So if you catch something, tell us. We're not affiliated with, endorsed by, or sponsored by any organization we cover.
And Revi, let's share with our listeners that we are delighted to be part of the DevX Podcast Network, a curated collection of audio shows for the global development community, dedicated to exploring the people, organizations, policies, and ideas shaping the sector.
Let's start where the symbol came from. Peoria, Illinois in 1980. A woman named Susan Goodman Komen dies of breast cancer at 36. She's been diagnosed at 33, and her sister Nancy Goodman Brinker watched the whole thing. The diagnosis, the fear, the stigma, and how little information patients could actually get their hands on. She came away with a clear conclusion. Susan might have done better if she had known more. The gap between what medicine understood and what patients could access was enormous.
That was the founding failure Nancy Brinker identified. Not just that breast cancer kills people, but that patients don't know what they need to know, and the culture doesn't let them talk about it. In 1980, breast cancer was still treated as a private matter. There were no toll-free numbers to call, no patient navigation resources, and very few support groups. Doctors had information patients could not access, and stigma meant many women did not even ask. Brinker's experience reminds me of Susanna Fox's book, Rebel Health. Fox describes how the internet allowed people newly diagnosed with any disease to find thousands of others with the same experience, creating peer-to-peer health information at scale. But in 1980, none of that existed. The modern internet was years away. Brinker had to build the public conversation from scratch, by hand, in public.
And build it she did. In 1982, Brinker founded the Susan G. Komen Breast Cancer Foundation as an on-the-ground movement. That fall, the foundation hosted a polo tournament and a lawn party at the Willow Bend Polo and Hunt Club in Dallas, and its first fundraising event brought in $30,000. The following year, Brinker organized the Race for the Cure, a 5K in Dallas with 800 participants, and invited former First Lady Betty Ford to speak.
That makes sense, because Betty Ford had already changed the conversations years earlier. In September 1974, just 6 weeks after Gerald Ford became president, Betty Ford was diagnosed with breast cancer and chose to go public. That was at a time when people didn't talk about breast cancer, but she did, openly and in detail. The response was immediate. Record numbers of women sought breast examinations. The surge became known as the Betty Ford blip, although blip kind of undersells it. It was really a major shift in what people felt that they could say out loud about the disease.
And 9 years later, in 1983, inviting Betty Ford to speak at the first Race for the Cure was a natural fit. By then, Betty Ford was the country's most visible breast cancer advocate, and the link between her public courage in 1974 and Brinker's movement in 1983 was clear. Brinker's choice to make it a race, in public, with survivors wearing pink, was itself the founding product decision. It said, "We are going to make breast cancer a public cause, not a private tragedy. The act of showing up, running, walking, being seen is both the fundraiser and the message."
That founding design decision has two implications that echo for the next 44 years. First, the unit of transaction is the individual participant. You sign up, raise money from your personal network, and show up in a crowd, and you feel part of something. The product being sold is belonging. That's a powerful emotional architecture. Second, the model implies a very specific funding logic. Large numbers of individual donors emotionally activated by a shared public experience. Not institutional funders, not a government grant. 1 million people giving $50 each.
That's a red flag right there. If you build your revenue model on mass emotional participation, your funding is always one bad news cycle away from disruption. The emotion is the asset, which means the emotion is also the vulnerability. One more founding detail. Nancy Brinker was married to restaurant executive Norman Brinker, founder of Brinker International. Multiple published accounts document that Norman Brinker provided early financial support and business guidance to the organization and remained involved as a board member for decades. This was no naive, idealistic startup. It was built with commercial sophistication from day one, and that shows in everything that followed.
Since 1982, Susan G. Komen reports that it has invested about $1 billion in breast cancer research, funding more than 2,800 research grants. It's widely recognized as one of the largest nonprofits dedicated specifically to breast cancer research, aside from the U.S. government.
Which brings us to the question we ask on every Impact episode. Does the fundraising story actually match the program reality?
With Komen, the answer is more interesting than a simple yes or no. The money raised does fund the mission. There's no financial misdirection here, and nothing like the Save the Children problem, where sponsorship dollars went into a general pool while donors thought they were funding a specific child. Komen raised money for breast cancer research and programs, and that's where the money goes. The financial alignment is real.
So what's the problem?
The problem is a different kind of mismatch. It's not between fundraising and programs. It's between the public's understanding of the mission and what the mission has actually become. Those are different things, and that distinction matters because it shapes everything that follows in this story.
Will you explain that?
Yeah. When most people think about Komen, they think of the race for the cure, the pink ribbon, and the idea of finding a cure for breast cancer. That was an accurate shorthand for the organization in 1983. But the mission has changed a lot since then. Today, Komen funds research grants, patient navigation, financial assistance for people in active treatment, policy advocacy, health equity programs, clinical education, screening outreach, and a staff patient helpline. By fiscal year 2024, most of the budget was going to program services all across those areas. In other words, the organization is doing the work that most of its donors probably don't even realize it's doing.
And the slogan, "Race for the Cure," does not help. The cure sounds like a finish line. Find it, cross it, done. But breast cancer is not one disease with one finish line. It is a set of diseases, each with different treatments, different research paths, and different support needs. And for the roughly 1 in 3 patients who eventually develop metastatic breast cancer, the disease is managed, not cured. For those patients, the cure framing was not just incomplete. It made their experience invisible. It suggested they were on the losing side of a war that everyone else had already won.
And that's the real harm, isn't it? One that metastatic patient advocates have pointed out for years. To Komen's credit, the organization heard that criticism and moved away from "for the cure" language with the "more than pink" rebrand. That was the acknowledgement that the original framing, while powerful as a fundraising tool, had left out part of the patient community the mission was supposed to serve.
So to be precise about the problem, the fundraising, the programs, and the mission are all moving in the same direction. What got stuck was the public story, coined in 1983 when the organization was just 800 people at a 5K and powerful enough to outlast the science and the patient experience that had moved beyond it. The organization changed. The public understanding of it did not keep up. And that gap between what Komen does and what people think it does is the thread running through the rest of this episode.
And as we will see, closing that gap is one of the hardest management challenges in the nonprofit sector. Every organization we cover on impact moves through funding phases. The question we always ask is simple. What money existed in the world that had not yet been pointed at this mission? Let's map that out for Komen.
Well, the first phase was the race for the cure, and it was grassroots, peer-to-peer fundraising. The model worked because it ran on volunteer energy. Participants did the asking, and the organization provided the event itself. It was a public spectacle that built community, broke stigma, and raised money all at the same time. At its peak, it drew huge numbers of people around the world. And the second phase was corporate cause marketing. And that's where the pink ribbon enters the picture, though the story is a little more complicated than people usually think, because the pink ribbon did not begin as a Komen campaign.
Wait, what? The pink ribbon wasn't Komen's?
Not originally. One of the earliest versions came from Charlotte Haley, a 68-year-old woman in Simi Valley, California. Her daughter, sister, and grandmother all had breast cancer, and in 1991, she started making peach ribbons by hand in her dining room. She attached each one to a card calling attention to the National Cancer Institute's budget and the lack of prevention funding. She eventually mailed tens of thousands of ribbons. It was a pure grassroots effort with no corporate backing and no organizational machine behind it.
Tens of thousands of ribbons tied by hand. That alone says a lot. By then, ribbons had become kind of a public language in the US. Yellow for troops coming home, red for AIDS awareness. But Haley deliberately chose peach, not pink. The color mattered. It was a way of saying that this is about prevention funding, and it's separate from the commercial world that was starting to form around breast cancer.
Then in early 1992, Alexandra Penny, the editor-in-chief of Self magazine, was planning the magazine's Breast Cancer Awareness Month issue. She already wanted to create a ribbon and work with Estee Lauder to distribute it at cosmetics counters. And then she heard about Haley's Peach Ribbon campaign. Penny reached out because she thought Haley's story would make a strong editorial feature. She wanted to spotlight Haley's campaign, not to claim the idea of the ribbon for herself.
But Haley said no. She thought Self and Estee Lauder were too commercial. Her daughter said Haley felt that they were making money off of someone else's pain and suffering. But Penny didn't drop the ribbon idea. She just made her own version in a different color, with no connection to Haley's campaign. And legally, that was the point. Haley could not claim ownership over an independently designed pink ribbon.
And Komen was already using pink at its own events. It had been handing out pink visors to survivors since 1990, and in 1991 it gave pink ribbons to participants in its New York City race for the cure. So the color was already associated with breast cancer before Self and Estee Lauder launched their campaign. What that 1992 campaign did was nationalize the ribbon as a standalone symbol, something people could wear anywhere, not just at a race.
From there, the symbol spread everywhere. Komen used it, Estee Lauder used it, Avon used it. No single group ever controlled the pink ribbon, not because no one wanted to, but because the symbol spread too quickly and through too many channels at once. To own something like that, you need a clear commercial first claim, and that never really existed here.
What Komen did protect successfully were its own branded assets: the running ribbon logo, Race for the Cure, and More Than Pink. Those were the pieces it could own. The generic ribbon itself stayed open, which is why eventually anybody could put it on a yogurt lid, a chicken bucket, or a bumper sticker.
And that's where the commercial ecosystem takes off. You get Ford Motor Company's Warriors in Pink, Yoplait Save Lids to Save Lives, and then a whole wave of products and merchandise with slogans like Save the Tatas and Feel Your Boobies. Some of those campaigns donated money to breast cancer organizations. Others were basically just selling product while borrowing the cultural power of Pink October.
And Save the Tatas is a good example of how far a symbol can drift once it escapes its original cause. It's not a nonprofit. It's not a Komen offshoot. It's a commercial merchandise brand. Some sellers donate a little to charity, but many are simply selling things. It sits in the same cultural space as Komen, uses the same color, but answers to no mission at all.
And that drew real criticism from within the breast cancer community, especially from women who had mastectomies or who were living with metastatic disease. Save the Tatas doesn't just feel trivializing. For some women, it's a blunt reminder of what cannot be saved. The pink economy grew around the cause, but it didn't always serve the population living with it.
Which brings us back to the bigger question. Can a cause own a color? In practice, the answer is no, not once the symbol escapes. The rainbow is tied to the LGBTQ+ identity, but no one owns it. Purple signifies several causes at once. Colors become symbol through repetition, and once they are out in the world, the organization that popularized them cannot control everything they mean.
And that's both Komen's biggest branding success and one of its biggest vulnerabilities. Pink October is everywhere. Komen gets credit for building the movement, but it can't control the commercial noise that sometimes overwhelms the signal. The brand is everywhere, and the generic symbol belongs to no one.
That's where the licensing and brand protection comes in. As the pink ribbon economy grew, Komen trademarked its own logo and branded phrases. Companies could license those marks in exchange for royalties, sponsorship fees, or co-branding deals. That turned the brand from a fundraising tool into a licensing asset, which is a very different business model.
And that created a very specific kind of risk. Komen depends on the emotional loyalty of a broad donor base, and that loyalty is tied to trust in the brand. When a partnership or campaign feels off, support doesn't fade gradually. It can drop fast.
The 2010 KFC Buckets for the Cure campaign is the clearest example. Pink fried chicken buckets, an $8.5 million goal, and about $4.2 million raised. Breast Cancer Action's response, and you're going to love this, is "What the cluck?" And it captured the backlash perfectly. Critics pointed out the awkwardness of tying breast cancer awareness to fast food, especially given the known links between obesity and cancer risk. But Komen defended the campaign by saying it widened reach through thousands of restaurants, including those in underserved areas. That was a real access argument, but also terrible optics.
And then there was the trademark side. After rebranding as Susan G. Komen for the Cure, the organization sent cease and desist letters to more than 100 small groups using phrases like cupcakes for a cure. The legal logic was brand protection and avoiding donor confusion, but the optics were bad. It made a major nonprofit look like it was policing or bullying cupcake fundraisers, which only reinforced the sense that the pink brand had become something to guard, not just share.
Each funding innovation expanded reach and revenue, but each one also added a new kind of risk. The race model built emotional loyalty. Corporate partnerships brought reputational exposure. And licensing required stronger brand protection. And that protection itself could become controversial. Every solution helped scale the mission, and every solution made the model more complicated. Every Impact episode asks this question at the inflection points. Was the organization learning, or was it just surviving? So let's look at Komen's major turning points.
In 2012, Susan G. Komen for the Cure stopped funding breast cancer screening grants to Planned Parenthood Federation of America, citing a new policy against funding groups under formal government investigation. At the time, Planned Parenthood was under a congressional inquiry focused on broad funding and abortion questions, not breast cancer services. Critics said the policy effectively singled out Planned Parenthood under political pressure.
And the backlash was immediate. Planned Parenthood framed the move as political and pointed out that Komen-funded supported breast cancer screenings for low-income women, not abortion services. But within 4 days, Komen reversed course.
But the damage was already done. Senior staff resigned. Founder Nancy Brinker stepped down later that year. Komen's fundraising efforts saw participation drop in multiple cities, and the total revenue took a hit.
The episode exposed something structural, how tightly Komen's financial ecosystem depends on being seen as neutral. Pink was supposed to be everyone's color. Once it got tied to politics, that sense of universality collapsed, and the money followed. That is what it costs to lose brand trust in a model built on brand trust. A brand that fragile needs a strong balance sheet underneath it. And here's what Komen's actually looks like.
Revenue has recovered from the low point it hit after 2012, but it still hasn't returned to its earlier peak. By 2020, revenue was down by millions. By 2024 and 25, it had climbed back to a little over 100 million, which is a real recovery. But recent filings also show repeated small operating deficits, which means spending has continued to outpace revenue. That's not a stable equilibrium, it's a buffer being used up.
And the revenue mix has changed too. By 2024 and 2025, Komen was depending almost entirely on contributions and donations. Corporate partnership revenue, which once played a much bigger role at the height of the pink ribbon economy, had fallen away substantially.
And that creates concentration risk. Komen's exposure is the emotional loyalty of a broad donor base. When one political controversy broke trust with that community, the effects showed up across race attendance in city after city at the same time. A lot of small donors who react in the same way is not the same as a lot of independent risk sources. The correlation is the risk.
Komen does still have a meaningful cushion in its net assets, but that cushion has already been used to cover losses. And a cushion that gets smaller every year is not something you can count on forever.
Yep, and the other structural vulnerability is October itself. The whole fundraising model is built around one annual cultural moment. If that moment ever slips away from Komen, if another group captures it, or if there's another major controversy that breaks the association, the revenue impact would be serious. At the end of the day, the model still rests on the race and the ribbon. We try here on Impact not to overstate things, and we also try not to ignore them. Komen does have a real impact record.
A late 2025 study looked at every targeted breast cancer therapy the FDA approved between 2012 and 2023. That is 19 drugs total. The researchers found that Komen-funded science, or Komen-funded investigators, showed up somewhere along the development path for all of them. That does not mean that Komen invented those drugs. Drug development is a team effort, and NIH, pharmaceutical companies, universities, hospitals, and other nonprofits all played major roles. But it does mean Komen became part of the machinery that helped move treatments forward.
So they didn't cure cancer, but they did become part of the infrastructure behind progress.
And that matters because breast cancer mortality in the United States has fallen dramatically since 1989. That progress came from better screening, earlier detection, stronger therapies, and years of research investment from many institutions. Komen is one player in that larger story, not the whole story, but a real one.
The organization's work on the ground is also more concrete than its public image suggests. In 2024, it reported tens of thousands of patient support interactions, millions in financial assistance for people in active treatment, and major investment in research. That's the kind of work that doesn't show up in a ribbon, but it does matter.
And then there is the equity piece. Black women in the United States still face much higher breast cancer mortality than white women. Komen has increasingly put resources towards that gap through navigation programs, culturally responsive support, and efforts aimed at underserved communities. You can debate whether that's enough, but it is no longer just an awareness organization.
That's the real paradox. The pink ribbon became so powerful that it sometimes hid the institution underneath it. But if you strip away the branding and the cynicism, what remains is an organization that helped build the funding networks, research continuity, patient support, and public attention that breast cancer was missing for decades. For the lessons, let's use two frameworks that help explain what Komen got right and where it struggled. The first is Isabel Guerrero's work on scaling development impact. And the second is David Scheiser and his work on nonprofit strategies.
Let's start with Scheiser. He's Columbia Law's Dean Emeritus and one of the leading scholars of nonprofit management. His book, How to Save the World in 6 Not-So-Easy Steps, makes a simple but important point. Nonprofits face two very different jobs, and they often blur them together. One is strategy. What should we actually be doing to advance the mission? The other is support. How do we get donors, staff, and the public to understand and fund that work? Those are not the same thing, even though organizations often act like they are. And that matters a lot for Komen. The money raised does go to the mission. The problem is not financial. The problem is that the public's picture of the mission has not kept up with what Komen actually does. In Scheiser's term, Komen has done reasonably well on strategy, but it has struggled to explain that strategy as it's evolved.
In practice, that means you can have a strong program team doing careful, evidence-based work, while the public story is still stuck in a slogan from 40 years ago. The work moved on, but the message did not. And when donors give to the story they know instead of the work they do not, you get a gap between perception and reality.
Scheiser's framework includes 6 Ps, and 2 of them fit Komen especially well. The first is pivot. Strong organizations do not just defend what they have always done. They test new approaches, retire what is not working, and adapt before crisis forces them to. Komen did eventually make those moves. The More Than Pink rebrand, the expansion into metastatic research, and the move towards patient navigation and health equity all fit that idea. But the key word is eventually. Too often, Komen pivoted after patient pressure or reputational damage forced its hand. The lesson is that resilient institutions build the habit of change before they need it.
The other one of Scheiser's P's that is important here is what he calls publicized. And that one is about accountability, not marketing. It means showing your work. Let people see the actual program, not just the story you tell about it. For years, Komen's public accountability was mostly walks, ribbons, and the money raised. Those are outputs. They tell you how many people showed up, but they don't tell you what changed.
That is why the late 2025 study matters. It found Komen touchpoints in every FDA-approved targeted breast cancer drug approved between 2012 and 2023. That is not a press release or a donor appeal. It's proof that Komen's funding showed up in the research pipeline behind treatments now used in oncology wards. That is what publicized should look like. It is the kind of evidence that starts to close the gap between what Komen does and what the public thinks it does.
And Guerrero gives us a different lens, but it points in the same direction. Her big idea is that durable impact does not come from scale or good intentions alone. It comes from building systems that can learn, adapt, and stay aligned with outcomes over time.
When you look at whether Komen became an institution or stayed a movement, it clearly became an institution. It started as a movement and built real infrastructure: national fundraising systems, long-term research funding, patient navigation programs, and sustained partnerships. A lot of organizations from that era stayed cultural and never built much infrastructure, but Komen did.
And when you ask whether Komen measured actual outcomes or just outputs or activity, the answer shifted over time. For years, Komen's success was measured in participation: walks, ribbons, events. That tells you something, but not enough. The newer research lens shows Komen-funded investigators inside the development pathway for a whole generation of drugs. That's system-level contribution, not just activity. And it's the kind of evidence organizations should be producing all the time, not only when critics demand it.
So here's what we've learned from the whole Komen story. 2 lessons that Guerrero's framework helps us see. First, Komen waited for crises instead of preventing them. The organization only made its biggest visible changes after facing public criticism and pressure, not before. It did adapt when challenged, but mostly in reaction to crises. The pinkwashing debate, the questions about research funding, and the internal conflicts. Komen responded to all of these, but rarely got ahead of them. A stronger, more resilient organization would listen to concerns earlier, adjust sooner, and not wait for a political firestorm to force the change. Second, Komen excels at making breast cancer public, but struggles to make the work public. This is the thread running through this whole episode. Komen is unusually good at turning a complex disease ecosystem into a mass public cause. They made breast cancer understandable, visible, and actionable for millions of people. That was a huge achievement. The harder task is translating the public enthusiasm back into real research, better clinical care, and actual patient support. The pink ribbon is easy to recognize, but the research pipeline is not. Closing that gap between the symbol and the actual work is Komen's unfinished business, and it's a problem many large nonprofits face.
One ribbon, one walk. a decades-long institution with real research impact, real patient support, and real public reach. The criticism is real too, but so is the contribution. Understanding Komen means holding both at once.
Nancy Brinker's promise to her sister became one of the most influential health nonprofits in the United States. Imperfect, contested, but undeniably consequential.
Thanks for listening to Impact. Like us, follow us, tell your friends, and give us stars. We'll be back soon with another episode on the business models of organizations doing well by doing good.